Season 2 of Written in Stone has been made possible in part due to the support of 2 sponsors, Tension Climbing and Rab, and I appreciate them both so much for that support. Rab began as a company in the 80s, and when researching what Moffat was doing in the UK in the 80s, I came across so many mentions of Rab Carrington, as well as photos of him at the crags. And his company, Rab, was born of and is still entrenched in the climbing community and are doing their best to keep this community moving forward while making the clothing that allows us to do just that. I'm a big fan of the Ascender Light Hoodie and the Cirrus Flex Light Puffy, and now that temps are cooling down, I'll have mine on for months. Rab, thank you. This is the second season of this show and the second season supported by Tension Climbing. I built my own company, Power Company Climbing, in parallel with Tension as they were coming up, and it's been incredible to watch. Every step of the way, they've innovated and given us better products. The thought that goes into each thing they put out is unmatched. And that includes the Tension Board too. It really is the best board out there. I'm not just saying that. You can learn more about the decisions that went into making it and how to use it at the link in the show notes. And to all the folks at Tension, thank you. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to the final episode of Season 2 of Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents, the 1980s.
1, 2.
I've been putting this off a little bit because attempting to distill the lessons and shifts in culture that are a result of the 80s into this wrap-up episode has actually been really difficult. Partly, of course, because we've also been finishing up the 90s book, so things are getting jumbled in my head, but also because it seems like it was forever ago that we started this season. And a lot of things have changed in my process and in my writing style, and there are just so many other factors that I have to try to separate out from what was actually happening back in the 1980s. And actually, I'm just realizing right now as I record this that this is a great metaphor for the 80s itself. There were major shifts taking place, shifts that many climbers, including the best climbers in the world, were sorting through in real time. Not only was sport climbing being birthed and established as a real force, but the definition of what was a send was changing, and new games are being invented, namely big wall speed climbing, big wall free climbing, and competition climbing. And to complicate all of that, the thing we started episode 1 of this season with was becoming a real part of the culture that just couldn't be ignored. Media, television, films, how we sell this thing. And I know sell this thing sounds negative, but it isn't. For climbers to make a living as professionals, there needed to be money in it. For it to continue growing, there needed to be money in it. To legitimize it, there needed to be money in it. And there can't be money if it can't be sold. So the commercialization and commodification of climbing, no matter how negative it can be painted, is, for most of us, one of the catalysts for us finding it to begin with. I mean, I remember seeing Cliffhanger before I was a climber. And when I went to the climbing gym for the first time, that's what I was imagining. And climbing gyms, those don't happen without that commodification. And we started this season with Patrick Edlanger. And Edlanger was the poster child for this struggle. A soul climber who was in it for the purity of climbing, but also commercialized it to the highest degree. It's not unlike Dean Potter or Alex Honnold in future generations. And that can be tough to parse out Where's the line that we shouldn't cross? Where does it become hypocrisy? Yes, Ed Langer was a legend, was a legend in his time, but he was also an influencer, one of the first big influencers. And now I know influencer also sounds negative, which frankly is just wild to me. Influence is just a real thing, and it can be a positive thing as well as a negative thing. But can someone be both legendary and an influencer? Of course. In fact, I think we began and ended the season there. Todd Skinner was in a similar situation. He understood the value of commercialization and was criticized for it by some of the climbers who couldn't see that same road forward. Climbers who ultimately were left holding on to an ideal version of climbing that was already in the past. Sort of. I mean, imagine for a second Ed Langer giving that thumbs up to Henry Barber as he lowered off from his monumental flash of the finals route at Snowbird 88. Coincidentally, I've had some chats with Michael Kennedy recently, who was in the balcony next to Barber and took an incredible photo of Ed Langer flashing that thumbs up. I'll drop that photo in the Patreon. And maybe I'll get Michael on for a bonus chat in the off season as well. But anyway, imagine that moment at a competition that was partly so dramatic because of the clash between the new school and the old, Trabue and Ed Langer. Here's the decisive winner giving a thumbs up to the de facto leader of the old guard, who's in a balcony watching the thing. Henry Barber is still a climber. He still gets to climb within the context of how he wants to climb. The domination of sport climbing doesn't destroy the way that he engages with climbing. Now, I do know that Henry Barber feels a way about sport climbing. He has opinions. He says on his website that climbing style and ethics have degenerated since Pete Cleveland's climb of Superpin in the Needles in 1967. And he's entitled to that opinion. And it makes sense given where he's coming from. But Pete Cleveland's climb of Superpin in the Needles in 1967 would also influence someone like Paul Piana, who later changes the rules of big wall free climbing. So Henry Barber is entitled to his opinion. And like I said, it makes sense given where he's coming from. But other people coming from that same place can still have a different opinion. Ed Langer came from somewhere else. I come from a different place. So do you. And me personally, I disagree with Barber. And that doesn't take away from his legend. I disagree with some of what Ed Langer and Backer and Croft and Trabue and Moffitt and Gulish and Skinner all believed. Hell, I disagree with a lot of the things old me believed. And that's how it should be. We should disagree. We should look back and be able to see things more clearly in hindsight. The 80s were 4 decades ago. If we haven't learned from them and moved past them, it's a sad state of affairs. But that moment, Ed Langer slapping over the roof of that finals route and lowering off, giving a thumbs up to Henry Barber. If Lynn Hill climbing the nose was the moment of the 90s, this might be the most poignant moment of the 80s, which was a decade of poignant moments. Chain Reaction appearing on the cover of Mountain Magazine and practically setting off a stampede to a backwater climbing area in Oregon. Jerry Moffitt stating that he just loves burning people off. Lynn Hill hanging on vandals to check out a hole in the roof and then smashing the thing. Gulish upping the ante at Arapiles. Backer bending his own rules to make a statement. Jill Lawrence and Rosie Andrews climbing right wall and then advocating for women in a firm voice. Wolfgang filling in the enlarged pockets on Wall Street and then redoing it, creating a new level in the process. Jerry's comeback, Skinner and Piana rewriting the rules in the place where the rules originated. Big moments. But for me, it's that thumbs up. Erlanger wasn't supposed to win. He was already the old guard, considered off the pace. He was all show. And if Didier Rabatou hadn't been disqualified, does Erlanger win? According to Alan Watts, post-comp, Didier flashed the finals route and then went around the corner to onsite the super finals route. It's not a stretch to think that Didier probably would have won had he not been disqualified. But if he'd won, we may not have gotten that thumbs up, that moment when the old guard proves not only that new doesn't mean better, but also that new and old can coexist, that sport climbing didn't delete trad climbing, that red pointing didn't delete on-siting, that artificial walls didn't delete having a connection with the outdoors, that a new, more dynamic style didn't delete being graceful and controlled. It can all exist together. New doesn't have to happen at the expense of old. Not in the case of climbing, anyway. Now, whether he knew it or not, that's what Erlanger was telling Barber with that thumbs up. We won this battle, but we're going to lose the war, and that's fine. We don't have to disappear. In fact, in a few decades, the foundation we built will shine through. Climbers like Jordan Cannon and Amity Warm and Alex Honnold and Brittany Goris and Babsy Zangirl and Will Moss and so many others will take the lessons they learn from sport climbing and indoor climbing and competitions and combine those with what they learn from the old guard and do new, bigger, even more exciting things. There will be more avenues to go down and specialize in. Avenues that diverge, sure, but that eventually join lanes or circle back around or at least weave in and out of each other. It's really a beautiful thing. And that is why I disagree with Barber. Style and ethics haven't degenerated. They've improved dramatically alongside athleticism and skill and equitable access and so many other things. Do we still get it wrong? Of course we do. But we're doing pretty damned good. And it's in large part because of what happened in the 80s. That's where this game of climbing as we know it was born. I hope that throughout this season I've shown that it wasn't a change as simple as wrap in, place some bolts, and we've got a whole new game. That's an oversimplified view of the shifts that were taking place. Instead, it was just as Alan Watts predicted, a chain reaction. And some folks have told me that it wasn't as complicated as I was making it. Yo-yoing to red pointing was no big deal. Wrap bolting, no big deal. Hang dogging, no big deal. But when you really dig into the conversations happening back then, you see that it was a big deal. It was getting sorted out not only in the magazines and at events like The Great Debate, which I'll be doing a bonus episode for the patrons on. You should join if you haven't. It's free. But it was also happening in the community. And from my vantage point, this was a community that became more globalized in the 80s, way pre-internet, and climbers were finding each other. Chain Reaction brought the world to Smith Rock. Wolfgang went to Australia to find the next level. Maybe most mind-boggling for me was what the women were doing. Somehow all of the women I landed on as people I wanted to learn more about had climbed with each other on several continents throughout the decade. And they often still talk to each other. It's amazing. Snowbird brought the best climbers from around the world to an artificial wall on the side of a ski lodge in Utah. Many of those climbers who'd never touched an artificial hold. What? And then, at the end of the decade, the pendulum swung back to Yosemite, but not at the hands of Yosemite locals. And then a decade later, near the end of the 90s, it would happen again. Avenues that share lanes and eventually circle back. And for me, personally, this season was also a big shift. I ended up writing every episode myself, which compressed my time frame for each episode and forced some changes in the way that I researched and wrote and recorded and scored and mixed. And these are changes that I now quite like. But if I'd stuck to the way that I had already done it, to the way we did it in season 1, changes I probably never would have made. In fact, while working on the 90s book, which coincidentally is at the printers and we are waiting on the proofs, so we're on schedule for an October 1st release. If you're in the Secret Stoners Club, you can pre-order it right now. When I was working on the 90s book and simultaneously making this season, I realized that decades aren't necessarily the best way to separate the history of climbing. It's a convenient construct, but it's not necessarily the best one. While talking with Boone Speed about some details in the 90s book, he said that he views the 80s and 90s as pre-Snowbird and post-Snowbird. He said this without knowing that I had just the week before put out a Snowbird episode. And I think he's right. And I plan to go talk to him about that and make a bonus episode about it because it's a really interesting conversation about how Snowbird changed everything. Which means I guess I'm lucky that Snowbird didn't happen a few years earlier in the middle of the decade. The fact that it's close to the end of the decade means I don't have to completely throw out my construct just yet. But just like climbing has evolved, so can we. And we may have to throw out that construct sooner than we think. Another thing that I'll be making a bonus episode about is the Great Debate. This was the traditionalists versus the more modern sport climbers coming together to discuss the future of climbing. And it's an interesting moment that I haven't covered in depth yet. It's been a part of several stories, but it really does an amazing job of symbolizing how we think that we should go about handling these changes. Even though we're probably wrong and don't have nearly as much sway over the zeitgeist as we think we do. It's a community effort. The big names don't necessarily get the amount of say that we think they do. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss it. We absolutely should. And we are going to continue discussing it 40 years later because history. Speaking of history, where on earth do we go next? Or maybe more appropriately, when on earth do we go next? The obvious play would be to jump to the 2000s. But we can't do that yet. And that's because of another constraint that I put on this thing from the very beginning. The podcast is called Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. And that subtitle screwed some things up. First, the apostrophe S didn't work in search, so it was hard to find. We've changed that to just Written in Stone Climbing History, but I guess it's still called Climbing's Most Important Ascents. But what does most important even mean? In a game that has so many sub-games, there are lots of most important lists. And if we're only focusing on the important ascents, then we miss a lot of the events that built the culture. And that's why this season I detoured to look at what women were doing, because women just hadn't been encouraged to be athletes yet. Title IX and general societal norms and expectations. So if we were just looking at firsts or important ascents, in air quotes, then women weren't showing up on the radar. And I knew that wasn't fair, and it's a detour I'm really glad I took because it did a lot to explain what was happening in the 80s. I wish I'd have done something similar with the 90s, but that's how change works. But there's another thing conspicuously absent from this season: bouldering. So, before we get to the 2000s, I'm going to take another necessary detour. We're going to go back, way, way back, to take a look at the history of bouldering. I say way, way back because there's evidence that British climbers were using the terms bouldering and problems as far back as the 1800s. So that's where we're going to start. And I think that next season will be a little different. More like what we did for the women of the 80s. Chronological episodes that combine characters and important moments to tell the story of a time period rather than that of a particular ascent. I imagine that we're going to pause on the really impactful characters and moments. John Gill and the Thimble, for instance, or Jim Holloway, Bob Murray, Flipper Feats. We'll pause on areas, Waco Tanks, Rocklands, Bishop, Magic Wood, and the constructs that have shaped bouldering, sit starts, pads, highballs, rating systems. But most of all, we're going to follow that specific avenue, bouldering, as it weaves in and out of climbing on a rope, as it informs other aspects of climbing, as it shares lanes and circles back. Because, yes, there are boulderers. There are sport climbers and trad climbers and alpinists and gym climbers, but we're all climbers. We're going to do that up to and through the 90s, some of which we've already covered, of course, and then, only then, will we be able to move into the 2000s. Maybe in our more traditional, most important ascents kind of way. After a break, of course. And speaking of breaks, I need one. I'm about to take one. So I don't know when this History of Bouldering season will begin. Sometime around the start of 2026. That's probably all I can say with any certainty. I don't know how long it will be. But I do know that if you join the Secret Stoners Club, you'll be the first to know when it's coming. And you'll get some bonus episodes along the way. I'm also going to be sorting out our YouTube channel. I've got some great footage that Alan Watts gave me of he and Ron Kalk and Wolfgang Gulish establishing the backbone, the direct start of which, also bolted by Alan, only recently got sent. Avenues, circling back, sharing lanes. If you haven't yet, subscribe over there. New videos are coming soon. You know where the links are. Last but not least, thank you. Thank you for listening. And Secret Stoners, thank you immensely for the support. Normally, I end this thing by coming back post-credits to talk to the Secret Stoners. I'm not doing that today because I'm not rolling the credits. I'm not really sure why, but it just feels better to leave it hanging. But I will say this. Like Todd Skinner always says, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.